I have a confession to make. I am a fiction author for a living, and yet I prefer reading nonfiction. Now, some of you will be my fellow lovers of nonfiction, and you will think, is that really a confession? What's wrong with that? Nonfiction is great, and you gotta do research, but it does feel to me, especially as the years have gone on and I've seen like reactions over the years to when I talk about what I'm reading, that I realize that it is a little bit of a confession. I've developed a little bit of shame about it, or like, if not shame, at least awkwardness. Like, here I am being that weird kid again. Truly, there is no greater pleasure to me than to start a novel and hit that point where it's just like, this novel, either I can't put it down, or maybe I can put it down, and I want to put it down just because it's so good that I don't want it to end. So I'm trying to like dry out the experience as long as possible. A really good novel that really clicks with me as a reader is just, it's an exquisite pleasure. But I am very particular, and I'm particular in ways that I can't really articulate. I don't know what I'm going to like until I start reading it. That I would say probably only like 10% of the books I start end up falling into that category of just like the most delicious reading experience. So I do find myself turning to nonfiction, particularly as like my pleasure reading. I often think of fiction reading as like the chore reading, and nonfiction reading as the pleasure reading, which is, that's weird, right? Like, I write fiction, and I hope that you don't think that about my books. I want you to read all the fiction. But at the same time, I do think there are some benefits to incorporating a healthy dose of nonfiction into your reading life if you are a writer of fiction. So I kind of wanted to talk about reading nonfiction, why to read it, and why it can sometimes feel like it doesn't belong, or like you're a bit weird for preferring nonfiction. And when I say you, I mean me. And I don't just read nonfiction for research either. I do have a fair bit that is research, but I would say that still over half of my nonfiction reading is not for research, or at least not intentionally for research. Ever since I was a little kid, I would just wander the library, and like, I would wander, it was not a very big library, so I would wander the whole nonfiction section of the library and just grab whatever stood out to me on that particular day, just following rabbit holes of different interests, which I still do to this day. I'm always floating around to different things that intrigue me. Like, we were recently watching the anime Golden Kamuy, and it takes place in like Hokkaido and parts of Siberia after the Russo-Japanese War. So after watching it, it deals a lot with like the tribal people too. I really wanted to learn more about that region. So I went to the library and I'm like, oh, please have a book on Siberia. And they did actually have one book about a guy who started traveling Siberia at first to lay down the telegraph lines, and then later was doing research for a book on like Siberian gulags. So he traveled across Siberia a couple different times, and it was a really interesting book. I read it in like 2 days, and it scratched that little itch somewhat. It didn't quite cover a lot of the things I wanted to know more about in Golden Kamuy, but you know, it was, for my small library, I was happy with it, and it was very interesting. So I can name you 1,000 examples of this kind of thing throughout my life, where like one little thing will spark an interest in another thing, and I'll wander around the library looking for that thing, but also just anything else that interests me. Sometimes just a certain thing will pop out to me that day, and I'll be like, man, I could read about that. So that's what I do whenever I go to the library, which I still love to do. I love to just wander around, look at all the nonfiction, and just like marvel at all the different things there are to learn about. And I think one thing that helps all author careers is staying open and curious about new ideas, which is why I'm so excited about the sponsor to this video, Brilliant. Brilliant is a learning app with a focus on STEM topics, and when I was young, I honestly thought that I had no interest in math or science or any of the STEM topics. I couldn't see any way of applying it to my real life or my creative interests. But Brilliant is such a fun way to learn new things in a way that are pertinent to real life. Brilliant helps you become a better thinker and problem solver with thousands of visual interactive lessons in math, science, AI, programming, and data. And as you complete each interactive lesson, you gain experience and level up. Yay! I encounter data all the time in real life when I'm reading nonfiction and doing research. So I started with Brilliant's data course. But I'm also curious about the AI one because we have been having a lot of conversation about AI in the writing community these days. And love it or hate it as a creative tool, I do want to come at it from an informed position. Brilliant makes learning about this stuff fun and engaging, and when you sign up for the app, you can tell it how much time you have each day for your lesson and learn it on the go across any of your devices. It's crafted by an award-winning team of teachers, researchers, and professionals from Stanford, MIT, Caltech, Microsoft, Google, and more. To learn for free on Brilliant, visit brilliant.org/thecozycreative. Scan the QR code on screen or click the link in the description. Brilliant's also given our viewers 20% off an annual premium subscription, which gives you unlimited daily access to everything on Brilliant. Thank you, Brilliant. Now let's talk a little bit about the wonderful benefits of reading nonfiction, and then we'll talk about some of the downsides. So what is the draw of nonfiction for me? I think as a writer, my main interest as a writer is characters, people, getting in the heads of people who are not me. I mean, some of them have a lot in common with me, but some of them have very little in common with me, and I want to do them all justice. So I want to know what it's like to experience everything possible. On one of the very first pages of Sylvia Plath's diary, she had an entry that stood out to me at the time I read it. It was written on July 7th, 1950, and she says, "I love people, everybody. I love them, I think, as a stamp collector loves his collection. Every story, every incident, every bit of conversation is raw material for me. My love's not impersonal, yet not wholly subjective either. I would like to be everyone, a cripple, a dying man, a whore, and then come back to write about my thoughts, my emotions as that person. But I am not omniscient. I have to live my life, and is the only one I'll ever have. And you cannot regard your own life with objective curiosity all the time." That passage really resonated with me because I have also just felt that draw to feel many different experiences. I often just have this weird disassociation with my life, as if I feel like I've been many other people and I could be many other people, and I don't particularly feel like I'm really myself, but that I'm just temporarily here in this particular life, and it's weird. I feel a little trapped sometimes in only getting to be one person with one life. And the beauty of writing is that you get to kind of experience a bunch of other lives. And of course, when you read fiction, a lot of it can be drawn from personal experience as well, but a lot of it isn't. Just the way I'm writing about all kinds of lives that aren't mine, I also know that other fiction writers are doing the same. And in fact, most of my favorite fiction novels are fairly autobiographical. I'm really drawn to that sense of truth in a narrative. And I also am very interested in other places and times, kind of the universal humanity and the universal experiences of humanity in different places and times, as well as the very different and alien things that humans can do when placed in a different situation, and just trying to square all of that. How are we all the same? And then by the same token, why do we make strikingly different decisions or have very different cultures? It's so fascinating to me. I just never stop being interested in what other people are thinking and feeling, and what other cultures are thinking and feeling, and how environments shape us. And I've poured a lot of it into my own work over the years, hoping that it brings a real sense of authenticity. And that is, in a way, research. But when I think of research, I mainly think of I'm sitting down to write this book in particular. When I wrote the Surrender of Sleeping Beauty trilogy, that was my very sexy, kind of dark fairy romance that was a retelling of Sleeping Beauty, but it was also very heavily based on the life of Marie Antoinette. And I read something like 10 books on the life of Marie Antoinette. And man, I destroyed these books in the process of reading them. I underlined and dog-eared so many pages. Sorry to the books, but I had just so many things I wanted to pepper into the novel as I was writing it to give it the sense of being a lived-in world. That to me is research, whereas most of my reading is more unintentional research, where I'm just reading things that interest me, and they could be just any kind of thing. One day I might be reading a book about the housing crisis and people that are homeless. And then the next day I might be reading a book about 17th century Germany. And it all just like, I don't have a point while I'm reading it, but it all just kind of goes in the mishmash of things in my head. And hopefully some of it works its way into my work, just in the sense of like developing fantasy cultures and individual characters and their experiences. I am a fantasy writer, so that world building is particularly important to me when I'm reading. And one reason I think I read just a tremendous amount of nonfiction of all types, because world building can be very intimidating. You're trying to fabricate an entire world with all the things that go into worlds and cultures, and you can't possibly be an expert in every subject. You know, I'm not immortal. I can only jam in as much as I can. I tend to focus on the things that interest me the most, but I want those to feel like real cultures. I want them to feel like a place that could exist, but isn't quite our world. It's a fantasy world, and I want people to be lost in it and feel like they're there and they've never been there before. So I think for fantasy writers in particular, reading a wide range of nonfiction can really bring depth to your world. And I do get the feeling that a fair number of fantasy writers mainly just read other fantasy books, and a lot of them feel very much the same. And there's nothing wrong with that. Readers like a sense of familiarity oftentimes, and I think as readers we've all had those moments where we finish a book that's amazing and we want another book that is similar to the one we just finished. And I'm certainly not shaming that. I felt that myself. And there's nothing wrong in kind of developing like the collective setting. Like a lot of people have written kind of the Tolkien-esque setting or the Game of Thrones-esque setting or the like YA Fae realm setting. And they're all a little different. They all have their own little spin, but they also kind of feel like they all take place in kind of the same world. But there are also times when I'm like, oh my gosh, give me something that feels fresh, for goodness sakes. And it can be a real delight when you come across something that does have something new to bring to the table that you've never seen before. And I think that's where you can kind of tell when an author has drawn from a rich bank of experiences and interests, reading material, influences to bring to their work. The main influences on my fantasy world are not fantasy novels. It was a real mixed bag. Nonfiction, video games, TV shows. I was very much influenced a lot of times by like the NBC sitcom lineup of the time, like Seinfeld and Third Rock from the Sun, that some of my dialogue that's more comedic, I feel like has a little bit of like a sitcom flavor. Watched a lot of anime. It's all over the map. You can see both the influence of some 90s anime and that whole phase I have with reading about the Renaissance. I also think that one of the things that has inspired me the most in my life as a writer is travel, and I don't actually like to travel. I find it very stressful. It is definitely inspiring though, but I can't always afford to do it, and as stated, I don't really like traveling that much, especially when I have to fly or go kind of far from home. I like to just take a train like 2 hours away. So when I can't travel, I think the second best thing, along with, watching YouTube videos where people just take you somewhere, is to read. And if you can't travel, you can travel the world and indeed different time periods and just put yourself in a bunch of different places. I also love reading the letters and journals and memoirs of different writers. It always inspires me to read about the lives of other writers and creatives in general, and just kind of see all the patterns, the similarities, and things that I can relate to, and remind myself that even people that in my mind are now like famous often had lives that were a struggle, times when they were not really acknowledged for their talents, and times when they were hungry or broke, or they dealt with depression and anxiety. They had all kinds of problems that kept them from writing as much as they might have wanted to, or just stressed them out. I just feel solidarity oftentimes with people's memoirs and diaries, and often I read the memoirs and diaries before I read their actual novels. I've been on a Shirley Jackson kick lately, and First, I read the recent biography that came out about her, and then I read her letters, and now I'm going to read a collection that has essays and short stories by her. And I did read We Have Always Lived in the Castle, so I did get a novel in there, but like I kind of often work my way from the nonfiction into the fiction, and like I read Lord of the Rings once, but I've read Tolkien's letters twice, and I just recently bought the unabridged Tolkien's letters so that I can read them again. There's that, and in a general sense, not just the comfort of knowing that other writers dealt with stuff, but also just reminding myself that whatever struggles I'm experiencing, like in the world or societally, have happened before. And often have happened in worse ways, and we've often just like kind of forgotten that those things even happened. So that brings me a regular sense of comfort when I'm like stressed out, I've been doom scrolling or something. It just kind of is a regular reminder that this has all happened before, and we knew that it turned out all right, so we tend to forget that it happened. Especially there's certain big things that are more remembered than others, but there's a lot of like smaller micro things. Like I've been reading a lot lately about the labor movement during the Great Depression, and it's been reminding me that things really sucked not that long ago, and people died to get us to the point where we had better working conditions. And like that's gonna cycle probably over and over, where people will have to really fight to retain workers' rights. So anyway, all that stuff I just find helpful in coping with the world. And I also tend to work it into my books, the way that history ebbs and flows and the way that people deal with it in different ways. So yes, I love nonfiction so much, but there is a problem when you're a fiction writer who reads mostly nonfiction, especially when you step outside of like, everybody kind of gets that you have to do research sometimes. And a lot of writers really dig research. So that's pretty relatable, and people don't really get surprised by it. Or if you read like self-help books on motivating you to be a better writer, and some author biographies and such. But when you start stepping into being the person who just devours random nonfiction all the time and you don't read a lot of novels, it can feel kind of awkward. The number one problem is just that it's harder to support your fellow writers. I really hate to bring up the Audra Winter thing again, but I have noticed that people keep talking about how Audra Winter doesn't really talk about other writers that have inspired her and doesn't talk about like other books. And to the point where it's gotten a little confrontational at times. And while I wouldn't say that applies to me, if I love a book, I will talk about it all the time. I think I've mentioned The Undertaking of Heart and Mercy alone on this channel like 5 times because I loved that book. I've definitely talked about it on like the Cozy Fantasy Reddit, and like I've recommended that book so many times. But because I don't read as much fiction, I have kind of a narrow bank of reading knowledge compared to a lot of other writers, and I just don't always get around to reading as many novels by my peers as I feel like I should, and I feel really guilty about it. Now, when I first became a published author, and I started out in young adult, for like 4 years, I pretty much set reading nonfiction aside, and I just read other young adult novels because I wanted to support all of my friends, and I wanted to be able to say, like, I read your book, I loved it. And I mean, I did enjoy a tremendous amount of these novels. I was reading so many novels, and young adult novels are often not crazy long, so I could get through a ton of them. And it was a lot of fun to support friends and recommend their books and be able to talk about what everybody else is reading. But, oh man, I missed my nonfiction like so much. And reading started to feel like kind of a chore for me after a while because I was only reading fiction. And I could feel my kind of like inspiration draining away slowly the more time that I spent mainly reading fiction. And after that, I just realized I don't want to read stuff just out of a sense of obligation that I need to support other writers. there are so many people that prefer reading fiction and love reading fiction, and I think that it is okay if I'm not one of them, if I come at it from a different perspective. I mean, I do love fiction, just I would probably rather read 2 nonfictions or start 2 nonfiction books to every fiction book that I start, and probably half the fiction I'm not going to finish versus like 75% of the nonfiction I finish probably. So I end up reading probably like 3 to 1 as far as what I complete. And that feels like a very satisfying ratio to me. But I feel bad that I don't always get around to reading my friends' books or the books that everybody is talking about. And to make matters worse, I'm a fantasy writer, but I like to read nearly every genre of fiction. I really like some various literary fiction and classics, and sometimes I just like a cute romance, and I like historical fiction a lot. I'm a little bit all over the map, so the amount of like books in my genre I actually read is fairly small, and I feel bad about that all the time. But I also do still feel like life is too short to not read what you want to read. But that is another disadvantage. Just lack of familiarity with your genre can be a disadvantage as far as knowing your market. And when you go to write a book, like if you want to make it marketable, you kind of have to know what people are reading, what they're liking, and what they're enjoying about it, so that you can try to capture some of that and put it into your work. Not in a like copying another book kind of way, but you know, you just want to know what readers are resonating with. And that's hard if you don't read the things that they are reading that might be comp titles for what you're writing. And there's also a big social media disadvantage, because a lot of what's recommended to post when you are a writer are to have a mixture of talking about your own book, but also talking about like what you're reading and recommending other people's books. And, you know, it's a little weird to show off my TBR pile when it's, you know, this kind of stuff. Random big ass book about Reconstruction, or this 1910s, I think, book about journeying around the world, or this From the Forest, A Search for the Hidden Roots of Our Fairy Tales. That sounds cool, right? Like a little bit pertinent to being a fantasy writer, and that's my TBR is like 75 books, you know, how that goes. But yeah, it's a little awkward when I don't have as much fiction on the shelf and people aren't reading what I'm reading. And in extreme cases, if you really don't read any fiction and you want to be a fiction writer, that is a terrible idea. It can hinder your ability to tell a story, because while I do think it's very important to know a lot of things about the world that you can incorporate in your books from a more grounded perspective of like reading real memoirs and histories and knowing like what's real, you also definitely want to know storytelling structure and how to convey the emotions of the characters. And stories shouldn't be real life. They are a little bit of a stylized version, and sometimes that actually feels more real to our hearts than reality does. So you want to be aware of that benefit of fiction, how to make it feel real, even though it's not. And that is a very different skill than good nonfiction. So that's also why I would never, ever give up reading fiction entirely, even though sometimes nonfiction does seem easier to read for me. I never want to lose that connection with storytelling and the craft of storytelling and the experience of running across a really amazing fiction novel that just sweeps you up, and whether it's real or not, doesn't matter. It becomes real as you're reading it and sticks with you forever in a way that becomes very true. There is a passage in my recent book that it just kind of poured out of me the way that a good passage does. I wasn't really thinking about it, but after it was over, I realized how much this passage rings true to me as far as like fiction writing and reading. The protagonist of this novel, Wanted Brooding Man, Tragic Past, loves to read, and the passage is, what was reality anyway? Anything could crumble away, even her own consciousness, if she thought about it too much, but stories would endure long after she was dead and forgotten. Surely certain stories existed just as deeply as she did in her own life. Una felt nothing could be as real as a story, told and retold, generations upon generations. And I feel like that was something that I felt deep in my soul that just happened to come out on the paper, that I feel like something like Lord of the Rings, a collective story that we all share, or of course many myths and legends and religions and fairy tales, come from this human shared experience of a story as it becomes more real than real. And as more of us share it, those stories and those characters become so real, because while most of us will die and be forgotten, the stories that we have all shared over generations become real to all of us, like representatives of all of humanity. And that's one of the really cool things about stories. But I also really recommend that if you do only read fiction, reading nonfiction can be great, so inspiring, and kind of connects me to humanity in a very different way. I don't want to tell anybody what to read because, like I said, life is too short to read something that you aren't really connecting with or enjoying. But I also sometimes wonder if people have ever really taken the time to just kind of explore the nonfiction section of a library and just let their imagination wander, even if it's more visual books rather than text ones. That can also be super inspiring. And yeah, I just love a good library stroll, just pulling books off the shelf and seeing what they reveal. And if you've ever felt like all the novels you're reading all feel the same and you're afraid that your novel might not be standing out, I definitely recommend nonfiction can be a great way to find a little extra something. Now, I would love to know, do you read a lot of nonfiction? Do you love nonfiction, or are you just more of a strictly fiction person? And if you do like nonfiction, what are some of your favorite nonfiction books of all time? What are some topics that you've done some deep dives on? What have you taken from nonfiction that has inspired your novels? I would love to hear it, so please share. And thank you again to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. Make sure to check the link in my description or on screen, or the QR code to start learning for free today. And if you'd like more from me, I have a Patreon and a Substack, as well as YouTube memberships. The Patreon and Substack both have a free tier, or the paid membership gets you access to 2 bonus videos a month voted on by you guys. If you'd like to read any of my books, I particularly recommend my Hidden Lands novels, and my new one, Wanted Brooding Man Tragic Past, is out this month. It's a good, cozy, spooky fall read about a girl who loves novels a little too much. It's given her a bit of an unrealistic expectation for her future husband. My name is Lydia Foxglove, and on this channel we talk about the creative life in general and the writing life in particular. So if this sounds good to you, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe. And I post every Sunday at 3 p.m. and sometimes also on Wednesdays at 8 or 9 p.m. Eastern if you'd like to catch me for a live chat. And thank you so much for watching. Thank you to all my Patreons and members for supporting me, and I will see you next time. Bye!